Welcome to the White Paper. This is the Deep Dive. Today, we are tackling a stack of sources detailing, well, probably the most controversial military action in the Western Hemisphere in decades.
We're going to be dissecting the ethical and strategic fallout from the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, in Caracas in early January 2026.
And our mission today is really for an audience of skeptics. We're not just going to summarize what happened.
No, not at all. We're actually staging a full debate on whether this high-stakes intervention was justified legally and ethically. We'll be looking at the official story versus the historical playbooks and the financial interests our sources reveal.
The operation itself was, it was just shocking. Reports were pouring in detailing U.S. military strikes right in Caracas. We had multiple sightings of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers.
Flying MH-47 Chinooks and MH-60s deep into Venezuelan territory. There were huge explosions, a really complex infiltration.
And what really stands out from the analysis is the risk. Military sources were saying this was, far from an ideal time for a mission this complex.
Right. It was carried out under a nearly full moon. They basically sacrificed all that covertness for speed.
Which led analysts to conclude what? That the target may have dictated the timeline?
Exactly. It suggests they had a really fleeting window to grab Maduro himself.
And immediately, the whole thing was framed as a win for criminal justice. Attorney General Pam Bondi confirmed the indictment in the Southern District of New York.
Yeah, and on some serious charges. Narcoterrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy.
And possession of machine guns, which is just wild.
So that really sets up the central tension for us right from the start.
Right.
Was this a legitimate national security action against a criminal regime? Or was the indictment just the legal cover for a regime change operation that was driven by other, less public motives?
Okay, so let's unpack those two competing narratives. Let's start with the official case, the pro-intervention thesis. It's all framed around national security and geopolitics.
The administration gave a few justifications. The first and most public was the war on drugs.
Maduro leading the so-called Cartel de los Soles.
Yes, though that's more of a colloquial term for the corruption. But beyond the drugs, they pointed to two really big factors that made doing nothing seem too dangerous.
The first being the migration crisis.
Precisely. Venezuela's collapse created this enormous push factor. It was fueling a refugee crisis across the whole hemisphere.
And the second reason?
That was the strategic one. The regime's connections to foreign adversaries. They explicitly named Iran and Russia as active partners in Caracas.
This whole idea of treating the Western Hemisphere as a primary national security threat, that seems to be a real policy shift, right? It's not just talk.
Oh, it's absolutely codified. This action fits perfectly inside the new U.S. national security strategy, which has this really unexpected and heavy focus on the region.
To the point where some sources have a name for it.
They're calling it the Donroe Doctrine, a sort of Trump-specific update to the old Monroe Doctrine.
The Donroe Doctrine, that's a memorable name. So what's the goal? Why revive this idea of regional primacy?
It's twofold, really. First, it's about pushing back against external powers, specifically China. Beijing invested over $8.5 billion in the region in 2024 alone.
Wow.
So that's a huge economic footprint. And the second goal is to neutralize hostile local governments.
Yeah.
Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua.
But it's the willingness to actually use force that seems different this time.
Absolutely. The strategy basically says that as long as Americans aren't dying, the president has a lot of leeway with voters to project American power. This tolerance for risk is really the engine behind what they call the limited force model for Venezuela.
Limited force. So not a full-scale invasion like Iraq.
No, they want to avoid that at all costs. The plan detailed in our sources sounds almost surgical. It's a mix of crippling economic pressure, covert CIA ops, and then these limited airstrikes inside Venezuela.
And the strikes aren't for military victory, they're for messaging. It's psychological.
It's psychological warfare. The message to the Venezuelan military leadership is simple. We're serious, and you need to make your deal now. Cut Maduro loose.
And they're offering amnesty to the military if they flip.
Yes, amnesty and modernization assistance. They want to decapitate the regime, take out the top Chavista leadership, but they want to avoid a total de-Baathification that dismantles the whole state. They're trying to keep the institution intact.
So the official story is clear. National security, regional dominance, fighting crime. But now let's turn the page. Because the skeptics, well, they uncovered a financial blueprint that tells a very different story.
A story that suggests this wasn't about narcotics. It was about oil.
Old-fashioned economic interest.
The prize is enormous. Venezuela has the largest estimated crude oil reserves in the world. And as the pressure was building on Maduro, we saw experts from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, publicly saying the U.S. needed to go big.
And what did going big mean exactly?
It meant that the top priority for a post-Maduro Venezuela should be a new bilateral investment treaty, one that defines robust protections for investors.
Okay, and this is the core of the skeptic's case. Who are these investors?
Well, this is where it gets messy. The same think tank, CSIS, that published this essay is heavily funded by the very oil companies with huge unresolved claims against Venezuela.
Exxon, for example.
Exxon gave them $250,000 this year. And even more directly, ConocoPhillips, which is trying to get an $8.7 billion settlement for seized assets, is also a major donor.
And these donations, these massive conflicts of interest, were not disclosed in the essays arguing for intervention.
Not at all. It creates the impression that corporate interests were funding the research that was then used to justify the national security rationale.
And then you have these really aggressive political claims from people like Stephen Miller.
Yeah, that was something else. After the U.S. seized almost 2 million barrels of Venezuelan oil, he called it the largest recorded theft of American wealth.
But then he went further. He said Venezuela's oil should belong to the U.S. because American companies created the oil industry there.
Which is, legally, that's an astonishing claim. It just flies in the face of the internationally recognized principle of permanent sovereignty over natural resources, or PSNR.
Right.
That principle basically says a country owns its own stuff, regardless of who helped pull it out of the ground. Miller's claim just dismisses the foundation of modern resource law.
This also brings up the legality of the military actions that led up to the capture, right? Operation Southern Spear.
Yes. The U.S. carried out at least 35 strikes on what they call drug vessels in the Caribbean and Pacific. A lot of people were killed.
So how did they justify using lethal force against suspected traffickers? Usually that's a law enforcement issue.
This is where the legal gymnastics come in. In October 2025, the U.S. officially notified Congress that it was engaged in a non-international armed conflict, an AIA with unlawful combatants, meaning the cartels.
And that declaration changes everything.
It changes everything. Critics argue this was a calculated move because once you declare an armed conflict, you can legally kill enemy fighters, even if they aren't an immediate threat. Without that NIA key declaration, these strikes are just extrajudicial killings.
With it, they're casualties of war.
Exactly. Legal experts like Reed Brody called the strikes murder. He even compared them to the kinds of killings that got former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte put on trial at the ICC.
That's a powerful comparison, and Congress just let it happen.
They did. The House defeated a resolution to prohibit unauthorized military action. The vote was razor-thin, 211 to 213. 2 votes. All while a naval blockade, which is an act of war, was already in place. Critics called it a complete dereliction of duty by Congress.
When you put this all together, the economic pressure, the limited covert force, it all starts to look like a playbook we've seen before.
You can draw a straight line back to the 1950s, to Eisenhower's policy in Central America. The research paper in our sources on Guatemala and Costa Rica lays out a perfect model for what we just saw.
What was the key takeaway there?
Eisenhower's team used coercion as their main tool. But when a country's interests diverged too much from U.S. interests...
Which happened in Guatemala with land reform.
Exactly. Guatemala's Decree 900 expropriated land from the United Food Company. Once that core American corporate interest was threatened, U.S. policy immediately escalated from coercion to covert intervention. The goal was to install a new government that was compatible with U.S. interests.
And it had to be covert.
Crucially, yes, to avoid the negative perception of violating their sovereignty. It's the same principle as 2026. Use special operations to decapitate a regime instead of a full invasion. You get the outcome you want without the diplomatic fallout.
This need for plausible deniability, it connects to these modern talks about licensed predation, doesn't it?
It does. There's this push to revive old concepts like letters of marque, legalized privateering.
So illegal piracy.
Essentially, yeah. It lets the state outsource violence to proxies. Think of the flying tigers in WWII. It allows you to degrade your rivals without having to go to actual war, and it keeps Congress out of the loop.
It's a way to project force while avoiding accountability at home.
And it fits perfectly with this administration's high tolerance for risk, as long as it's not officially American soldiers dying in a declared war.
Finally, we have to consider the history inside Venezuela, because the stability of any new government there is a huge question.
A very important question. Our sources look back at the Castro communist insurgency in the 1960s, the FELN.
Which was incredibly violent. Urban terrorism, sabotage, a whole campaign to try and stop the 1963 election.
They tried everything to discredit the democratic process. But what happened?
The election went forward, and the turnout was insane. Over 91% of eligible voters went to the polls.
It was a stunning rebuff to the insurgents. It proved that, deep down, the Venezuelan people prefer democratic stability over violent chaos. Any new government has to understand that if it wants to survive.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize all of this. What does it all mean? The official U.S. line is that the Maduro capture was a necessary anti-drug op, part of this new Don Road doctrine for the hemisphere.
But the skeptic's case is very compelling. You have these powerful corporate motives tied to oil and seized assets. You have think tanks pushing for intervention while being funded by the companies that stand to gain.
And the whole thing is built on a very shaky legal foundation, using this controversial declaration of a non-international armed conflict.
Right. It echoes this historical U.S. playbook of escalating from economic pressure to covert action whenever American corporate interests are threatened.
So the debate really boils down to whether the stated goals, the moral, strategic ones, are the real drivers, or if they're just a sophisticated cover story for money and power.
And the final critical unknown is what comes next. Even the new national security strategy admitted that relying on these coercive tools in Latin America is risky. It could undermine partnerships, push countries closer to Beijing.
So the final thought for you to reflect on is this. Now that the controversial capture of Maduro has succeeded, will this high-risk gamble lead to a stable, prosperous, U.S.-friendly Venezuela?
Or is it, as one source put it, more likely to produce a Libya in the Western Hemisphere?